Hello, I'm Anwultus, and today I want to tell you my opinion on the Ukraine crisis and Russia and the US involvement, as well as who I think is right and who I think is wrong in the conflict. So let's get down into it. So I've pulled up a map of Ukraine. So what's happened recently is that these two regions in the corner, Donetsk and Luhansk, uh, since about 2014 have been in rebellion against Ukraine and have declared their own independence, and they have been actively backed by the Russian Federation. And Crimea, which had formerly been part of Ukraine, was also annexed by the Russian Federation. And that's, of course, onto a larger backdrop of a an ongoing conflict between the U.S. and Russia, or more broadly NATO and Russia and the Union state, as Belarus is also involved, at least allowing Russian troops to pass through their territory in order to attack Ukraine. So what is my opinion on who is right in this conflict? Well, I think one thing that needs to be understood is the history of this conflict. And I would like to emphasize that before people started firing bullets, the US and Russia have already been, in a large number of ways, in a conflict. Perhaps not a conflict, a hot conflict, but a cold conflict in a number of different ways. A conflict of intelligence, a conflict of coups, a conflict of a wide range of things. Uh, and one of these is, of course, the overthrow of the Ukrainian government. Because if we look at the grand scheme of things, Ukraine is close to the core of Russia, and therefore, strategically speaking, by the way, I'm not saying that the Russians are justified in their attack. I'm just discussing the strategic implications here. Strategically speaking, Russia doesn't want a NATO ally to be this close to their home territory here, because if you look at Russia geographically, this northern area here is more difficult to inhabitate. So a lot of population is concentrated in this area, especially right around here. And if we go on a satellite map, this may be a bit more apparent, where we see that there are a number of cities in this area, and there's a large amount of agricultural production, as well as industrial development in that area of Russia, as opposed to farther north, where you can see it's a lot more forested and a lot less developed in a number of different ways. Of course, there are places where it's more developed. But anyway, one of the foreign policy pushes of the United States over the last couple of decades has been to maintain NATO after the fall of the Soviet Union and try to get closer to Russia and encircle Russia in a number of different ways. And we see that in proxy conflicts, as well as other minor conflicts throughout the world, where, of course, Turkey is in NATO, but the U.S. is getting friendlier with Georgia, whereas Russia has cut off a couple of split away republics from Georgia. Recently, there's a conflict with Armenia and Azerbaijan, where Russia, of course, is supporting Armenia. Russia supports Iran, U.S. supports Turkey, and they're natural rivals in the region. Russia supports Syria. The U.S. supports Israel and other countries. And, of course, speaking about Syria, I'd like to point out that during the Obama administration, the U.S. moved forward with promoting a number of coups and rebellions in various countries. And This is not a wild conspiracy theory. This actually happened. An example here is Timber Sycamore, a CIA operation in which weapons were smuggled to rebel forces in Syria. Some of these would eventually reach people like the Islamic State. So in some ways that backfired. But in Syria, this exacerbated the rebellions, and of course Egypt and Libya. The U.S. was supporting rebellions in those places as well as many other places. But in Syria, there's still an ongoing conflict. Many thousands of people have died. Many thousands of people have been displaced, and that's just looking at Syria and not the broader consequences in Libya, other parts of Africa, parts of Asia, where Arab Spring and other revolutions occurred under the backing of the Obama administration. This has had a huge human cost, is what I'm saying, and it's led to this ongoing conflict in Syria, as well as the migrant crisis in Europe, which has become politically controversial in a number of different countries and has led to a large number of people moving to Europe and having difficulty integrating into Europe, which has caused domestic problems in many of those European countries, and also caused backlash from more far-right extremist groups who see this as an attack on their nations. So in some ways, this policy in Syria alone has led to a lot of damage, not just in Syria, but throughout Europe and the Middle East. And another thing that occurred during the Obama administration was, of course, the Euromaidan or Euromaidan. I don't know how to pronounce Ukrainian. But it's the rebellion that started in 2013, moved into 2014, in which the Ukrainian government was eventually overthrown. And I would add to that this was actually an elected government of Ukraine that was overthrown by people that were pro-Western, pro-EU, pro-NATO, pro-US. And there are a lot of indications that the U.S. was involved to some degree in the protests, in supporting the protests, and also in the political aftermath of the protests. For example, I'm looking at this article from the Cato Institute, which is a libertarian-leaning group. So they're not in favor of Russia. They're not in favor of American imperialism. They're not in favor of various other groups. They're more interested in individual liberty and such things. So they don't really have a reason to be biased pro-Russia or pro-US on this particular issue. And they discuss that there are a number of different instances where the U.S. was meddling in Ukrainian politics before, during, and after the revolution in Ukraine. Now, this is, of course, very surface level stuff, very likely, just like in Timber Sycamore. From what I hear, it's likely that American NGOs were training protesters and doing various things, as they did in Egypt, Hong Kong, and other places. So, but this is all connected. The Hong Kong protests, the revolution in Ukraine, the Arab Spring, and such things. These are all parts of the U.S. policy, and a lot of this is declassified. Some of it is still classified, but relatively apparent from what we're seeing. And of course, this happened under the Obama administration, alongside Joe Biden, Hillary Clinton, John Kerry, and others who were involved. And a lot of this stuff carried through the Trump administration. So let me be very clear. I'm not just saying that Obama and Biden are the only people responsible. I think Trump could have done things to have what I would refer to as a more honorable foreign policy, because I don't think covertly going into other countries and sending weapons or training protesters or doing things like that is a very honorable way to deal with other countries, especially if you're saying you're pro democracy, but you help them overthrow a democratically elected regime. I think that's a bit silly. And by the way, I knew this before. I knew all of this before this whole Russia-Ukraine crisis started. So this isn't coming out of Russian propaganda that came out recently. This is something I've known for a number of years, because all this stuff started in 2013, at least in relation to Ukraine, when it started being in the news. So in that sense, I would say that it's not unfair when Putin or others refer to Ukraine as an American vassal, because in many ways, the U.S. has had strong involvement in the regime change of Ukraine and in the development of Ukraine's foreign policy after the regime change. And this isn't outside of the U.S.'s MO, because we know the U.S. has done regime change in the Americas before, in various other countries. So I find it weird that a lot of people are so eager to call out U.S. involvement in the Pinochet regime in Chile, but not in Ukraine. So anyway, what I'm saying here is that I don't think that the U.S. can take the moral high ground here, because the U.S. did something very similar to what Russia did, except they didn't actually fight. And I think it would have actually been more honorable if they did fight, because I like people being honest about what they're trying to do. I don't like subterfuge and such things, but that's my personal moral compass there. So now Russia. I don't think Russia is right either here. Okay? And the reason I don't think they're right is because obviously Ukraine is a different country. So in that sense, they have sovereignty over Russia. Ukraine has sovereignty over Ukraine. Although, arguably speaking, Ukrainian sovereignty is in some ways subordinate to American interests nowadays. But until just recently, when as this is going on, the U.S. isn't actually helping Ukraine when it's being invaded. So I think that's also an irresponsible part here. The least you could do is actually defend the country whose government you have helped regime change. But that's not happening. What we're seeing is sanctions, and unfortunately for the U.S., Putin has already prepared the Russian economy for sanctions. So they're not going to be as effective as a lot of analysts say they're going to be. Also, Putin has escalated faster than the U.S. Has kept up, which means that Russia has continued to have the initiative in the conflict and just a greater potential for force throughout. When you hear talk about Putin talking about potentially nuclear options in retaliation for interference in his invasion of Ukraine, and we don't hear Biden talk about anything nuclear, it's just very concerning that he's not keeping up with how fast things are moving. But knowing Biden's age and various allegations about his health, it's not too surprising. But what's happening in Russia is obviously they don't want this Ukraine to become an American ally, and they see the U.S. aggressing against them. So I do think that it is true that the U.S. is aggressing against Russia, but it's also true that Russia is aggressing against the U.S. So you have all these different hacker wars that have been going on the past few years. I think in both cases, the U.S. and Russia can argue for a just war against each other. Uh, Russia knows that they can't win, so they're obviously not going to do that. And the U.S. just simply doesn't have the courage or the willpower to pull through on that. And another thing that's happening in Russia is demographic decline. There's huge problems with birth rates, and beyond that, there's also problems with massive numbers of abortions in Russia. And that's not too surprising because obviously Russia is a post-Soviet state, so all those countries have had a depression in their birth rate and various things. But another thing that's happened that it's surprising how few people know about this National Security Study Memorandum 200, which was eventually adopted by executive order into U.S. policy during the Ford administration. This document essentially outlines a plan for global population control. By the way, this is official U.S. policy that was implemented starting in the Ford administration. And if you read it, it talks about abortion, about family planning, about sterilization, and various things. And in large part, this specific project is responsible for a lot of population reduction throughout the world since its implementation. Of course, written by Henry Kissinger. And so it is part of U.S. policy to reduce the populations of second and third world countries in order to reduce foreign policy problems. Now, if you count abortions and such things, then this is possibly one of the deadliest genocides in history that almost nobody knows about. And by the way, yes, this is official. This is not a conspiracy theory. And I do think that under UN definitions, this probably does count as a genocide, even though most of what's happening is voluntary and caused by propaganda. But anyway, so Russia's population is declining. It's because they're so post-Soviet country, but also possibly contamination from U.S. policy. And by the way, when this was implemented, Roe v. Wade hadn't happened yet, so they didn't think that this was going to affect the U.S. as much as it did the propaganda that they were putting out because of it. But anyway, if the Russian population collapses, then what's going to happen is that various independence movements, for example, the Chechens down here, various majority Islamic groups that don't want to be part of Russia in this area, as well as potentially some groups out here, are likely to declare independence from Russia as the Russian-speaking, at least culturally orthodox majority becomes a minority. They will no longer be able to hold together the Russian empire. And I'm using empire in a Hamiltonian sense, where, as people might be aware, Alexander Hamilton called the United States an empire in the Federalist Papers. And so I'm using it in that sense, not in the sense that it's got an emperor or that it's necessarily aggressively expanding, although it is right now. But the point is, many analysts think that if Russia doesn't do something to expand its Russian population, which they could by assimilating the Ukrainians, or something to provide you could say, a boost to optimism in Russia, that Russia as a unified country will cease to exist within the ensuing decades. So when Putin says that this is an, a move for the existential survival of Russia, he is not speaking from a position of dishonesty. Now, you can argue whether or not the situation is as dire as Putin thinks it is, but it is the case that a lot of analysts do think that it is as dire as Putin says it is. So, nevertheless, both countries have, I would say, in my view, that still doesn't justify the invasion of Ukraine. Now, if you consider it as Russia being functionally at war with the United States, if not actively at war, then it makes perfect sense to attack Ukraine because Ukraine is an American asset, and therefore would be a valid target under that assumption. But if you produce the legal idea that Ukraine is a sovereign country that has not done anything against Russia, then that's not something that's valid. However, I do think I agree with the position that Ukraine is a tool of the United States against Russia, geopolitically speaking. Now, the U.S. has decided to discard the tool in a number of different ways. They're not giving them access to NATO. They're not sending in the troops. The U.S. isn't even at nuclear readiness. They're not even doing a draft. So the U.S. isn't showing a willingness to fight right now over Ukraine. And by the way, I will say that Putin has done assassinations, he's silenced his opposition, he's done various things. So before anyone says that I'm a Putin shill, I am indeed condemning Putin, okay? I'm also condemning the U.S., and I'm also hawking for the U.S. to wage war against Russia. Because if we're playing this geopolitical game, okay, if we're involved in this, the U.S. that is, then the U.S. should try to win, okay? And the U.S. can win. The problem is the U.S. doesn't want to win. They want to do sanctions. They want to have a Cold War so that everybody in Europe is in fear for the next few decades instead of actually fighting a war and achieving lasting peace, which, in my opinion, is what should happen at this point. And I think that if the U.S. were to wage war, and I know that this is going to be a controversial opinion, the U.S. could gain large amounts of territory in Siberia, because Siberia, in my view, in the case of the U.S., is the perfect place for the U.S. to expand to. It's close to Alaska. If you look at a global perspective, you see that it of course is massive. I'm not going to lie about that, but Anchorage is a very busy cargo airport that has coverage over a lot of area here. So it's not going to be as disconnected as a lot of people think, is what I'm trying to say here. It also would allow the U.S. to put more pressure on China. as China is another rival that I think that the U.S. should deal with at this point anyway. Uh, Not because I hate China or I want to interfere in internal Chinese politics about various things, but because I think it's fair to say that the U.S. and China are in active conflict, not in active war, but in active conflict, and I think that that means that the U.S. has an opportunity for a just war with China, and in the interest of long term peace, uh, fighting a short term war, in my view, is not as bad as entering into long term Cold War with proxy conflicts. Because look at how that turns out for Israel. Okay, Israel, West Bank, Gaza Strip, constantly rockets firing into Israel. Israel spends massive amounts of money on technologically advanced defense systems, uh, and the U.S. is funding that. Okay, a lot of that money is coming from the U.S., but they're not actually fighting a war to win it. If Israel was serious, they could take out their opposition and actually not have to spend that much money on all those complex defense systems. But unfortunately, the international community has decided that that would be very wrong for Israel to do. It would be very wrong for Israel to actually try to gain control of its own territory, to actually try to win a war against aggressing people that are targeting civilians. I think I think that's a silly position to take. So people that are saying that the U.S. needs to de-escalate, the U.S. needs to uh, not respond with military force. Putin has invaded Ukraine. Okay, he's already talked about nukes. He's mobilized his troops. What are you gonna do? And he doesn't care about the sanctions because he's prepared the economy. He's going to crack down on the protests in his own country, and I'm not actually faulting him for that. I think that if people start attacking police and entering into violent protests, I think it's fair to crack down on protests. If the law says that you can't protest in a certain place, while I would want to change the law to allow for lawful protests, uh, the law is the law. Okay, I'm a law and order guy. The law is the law. People want to protest against Putin. They have to do it in an orderly manner. Uh, but anyway, why is Siberia perfect as a place for the U.S. to annex? Well, it's scarcely populated, just like the Old West was in the U.S. There's a lot of natural resources. There's a lot of room for development and investment, and the local people would, in my view, probably benefit a lot from investment into those areas because the corruption in the Russian government means that a lot of these areas are not as developed as they could be. Russia could be the world's, maybe not number one, but pretty high up in the world economically speaking, but they're not. Uh, Someone pointed out in the news their economy is smaller than South Korea. Uh, I think an executive at Google said that Russia is Nigeria with snow. And Nigeria isn't famous for being a rich country nowadays. Now, they are getting richer, but they're not famous for being a rich country. But Russia has all the resources they could want to be a rich and self sufficient country. But there's a lot of corruption holding them back. There's corruption in the government, corruption in the local government, lack of enthusiasm, optimism, confidence in the future, and a large number of people, huge amounts of alcoholism, deaths from drinking, among the older populations of Russia. So, if the U.S. took over Siberia, that would also cut off another border for North Korea. But it would, in my view, be something that would benefit the U.S. in a number of different ways and also benefit the local population as well. Um, and also put pressure on China. And so I think that both sides are wrong. Okay, let me be very clear. I don't think the U.S. should be doing regime changes in various places. I don't think that Russia should be as corrupt as it is, and I don't think that they should be as aggressive necessarily as they are. But I think that if we're going to have a war, okay, if there is a conflict, the U.S., me being someone that supports the U.S., another reason not to call me a Putin shill, even though I've in some ways justified Putin's thoughts on Ukraine. Of course, I am denying that there is a Russian genocide in Ukraine. I simply don't see that. I know where it's coming from, but I don't see it. Okay. I favor the U.S. taking opportunities to expand, just like many of the earlier generations of U.S. presidents did. And when I say expand, I don't mean overthrowing governments and putting these puppet regimes in various places. I say, if you have a government that works, why don't you use that government? Okay. Not that the U.S. government is perfect. I'm actually in favor for a wide range of reforms. If you know me, you know that I actually want to reform a huge number of things. But I think that a new Wild East perhaps is just what the U.S. needs for some optimism in the future. Just new opportunities, a land of opportunity, because Russians aren't using it. Not gonna lie, Russia is a country in decline, and that's why they're pushing out. So this is sort of the opposite of a Thucydides trap, because the Thucydides trap is when a new power is rising, and the conflict then starts between the new power and the established power in order to decide who is going to be the new power in the system. But in this case, Russia is in decline. They started their decline with the Soviet takeover. I'm actually arguing in favor of saying that if they hadn't overthrown the imperial government, they probably would have been economically in a better place during the time of the Soviet Union. And that's also one of the reasons why Germany in World War I was fighting against Russia. They didn't want Russia to become a great power, and Britain didn't want Germany to become a great power, and various conflicts, politicking, various things. But they could have been a great power. They ended up in decline, and now they have to do something, or their country is going to collapse. And Ukraine is what they chose as their battlefield. Some people are thinking they'll move into the Baltics. It all depends on how the U.S. government reacts, because Joe Biden didn't really seem very keen on fighting back. And so the real question is NATO going to enter into this? Who knows? Okay, who knows what the future holds? What I do think is that China, just like Russia, is also having a population problem, and also entering beyond that, they're also entering into huge economic problems pretty soon. If they're not already in big problems. So in the next few decades, neither Russia nor China will become a world power. Let me be very clear. Even if the U.S. does nothing, if the U.S. just quits NATO and they go full isolationist, uh, neither Russia nor China will become a world power. They'll both have huge problems and collapse. Not necessarily fully collapse because China is kind of hard to destroy, though. China will still be China even without the communists, contrary to what the song says. Um, but I think that the United States, economically, geographically, uh, is perhaps one of the best positioned countries and will continue to be a world power in the coming decades. The real question is after this crisis, because we're going to be seeing a huge economic crisis pretty soon, not just because of the Russian sanctions and various things, but also because of huge stagnation because of coronavirus, huge inflation in the Federal Reserve, uh, another housing bubble, various things happening in the U.S. that will cause massive economic problems. And the question is who's going to come out on top? I see a political realignment happening. And while I think the U.S. will continue to be the major power in the world in the coming decades, even if it does nothing about what China and Russia are doing, uh, I I don't know how well the U.S. will do beyond that. So people in the U.S. really need to, instead of simply looking at, oh, what's this country doing, what's that country doing, which side should we take, the U.S. should also think about what's wrong with the U.S. and what to do about it. Because I think one of the things that brought the U.S. into this trouble is this foreign policy about overthrowing regimes and supporting rebels in various places that has a massive human cost. We saw it in Syria. Now we're seeing it in Ukraine. We saw it in Hong Kong. Hong Kong went into the protests. The U.S. supported the protesters. Marco Rubio was trying to allow protesters from Hong Kong to escape to the U.S., cutting the red tape for that. And now they've squandered their liberty, and a protest over what I would argue was not as major of an issue as a lot of other people think ended up with the PRC having greater control of Hong Kong. Uh, in Syria, the rebellion against Syria led to the rise of the Islamic State. The U.S. sponsored this, okay? Islamic State killed thousands of people, not just in Syria, in Libya, in Nigeria, in Afghanistan, various places, in Iraq. And Syrian government still stands, and they still control the lion's share of the country. So, and the Middle Eastern migrant crisis caused by this as well. So that's another fail. Obama, Biden, Clinton, Kerry foreign policy. Ukraine, Euromaidan, immediately massive rebellions throughout eastern Ukraine. A lot of them got put down, but Russia moved in, seized Crimea. Luhansk and Donetsk republics broke free and started fighting the Ukrainian forces for independence and were backed by Russia. And now, in the fullness of time, Russia has decided if the U.S. gets to play around with Ukraine, so does Russia, and they're going for all of it. Well, maybe not all of it. They might cut off Bessarabia, Galicia, those areas. Those areas are a bit exposed. They're not the most defensible positions, so they might cut off those areas and not go into there. But they're moving to take over most of it. I don't know if they're going to fully take it over and integrate it into the federation as they did Crimea. They might put a puppet regime, maybe put it as a member of a union state like Belarus is. And those two countries are going to be independent and who knows about Abkhazia and South Ossetia and Transnistria. Uh, who knows what's going to happen with those countries? But but the U.S. is now suffering a problem of its own making, and it is upsetting to me to see cowardice from people who are not willing to actually defend American interests. Not saying that the U.S. was justified in the first place. What I'm saying is that there's a difference between starting something and fighting in something. There's a difference between fighting in a war and starting a war. There's a difference between uh, an unjust cause of war and a just war. Uh, and I think it's possible to wage a just war even if the cause in the beginning was unjust. I know there's a lot of people that disagree with me, but I think that this is a necessary distinction to make. Um, but I think that people that say we need to stop Putin, but they're not willing to commit to force, a lot of those people, they're not political realists because they don't know that what you ultimately need is force. What keeps peace in the international system is a fear. So once a country becomes fearless and they start invading other countries, then you need to do one of two things. You need to either reestablish fear, you need to produce love, and which is difficult. As Machiavelli said, it is better to be feared than to be loved. That's not to say that fear is better than love, but it's easier to produce fear than love in a power relationship. Uh, and, and if you can't produce fear, if you can't produce love, so if you can't threaten Putin, if you can't negotiate with Putin, then the third option is to go all in and win, triumph, uh, and you know what? Benefit from the triumph. Why not? Okay, if you're going to win, might as well take some land, and I think there's plenty of land ripe for the picking. But I know that there's a lot of people that are super anti-imperialists. They don't want to hear about that. They don't want to follow in the footsteps of many American presidents who didn't have a problem with this line of thinking. They don't want to follow in the footsteps of many people throughout history who understood the value of power dynamics, of increasing the power of your country so that your country is able to produce a better peace for itself. Because people say, oh, the U.S. Should just get out of here. But Straits of Hormuz actually pretty important to the U.S. Because of trade and various things. The U.S. is heavily involved in trade in various places, which is why very early on in American history, the U.S. Began building up a navy and began launching anti-piracy operations. There's the whole war with the Barbary Coast. There's the anti-slave trade operations the U.S. was doing along with Britain. There's other operations in the Pacific early in American history that were being done against various people who were unfriendly. And I'm not saying that the U.S. needs to go out and seek to conquer places. I don't think that that's what the U.S. should be doing. What I'm saying is, if there is an aggressor, the U.S. needs to put its foot down and actually fight back. Okay, I'm not saying the U.S. has a responsibility to defend Ukraine. I am saying that the U.S. Not a natural responsibility in the sense that the U.S. is the world police. What I'm saying is Ukraine is an American asset, uh, based on what I understand about what happened in the revolution and the establishment of today's Ukrainian government. It is a U.S. asset. An attack on Ukraine is an attack on American interests. And even if we don't like the fact, even if I personally am highly critical of the fact that the U.S. had interfered in Ukrainian politics, and we're not going to talk about Biden and Burisma, Chalupa, the DNC in 2016, various other shenanigans. Okay, we're not going to talk about that, but even if we don't like what's happened, I think that the U.S. needs to try to win. And I think just like Russia winning in Ukraine is viewed by Putin as something that will benefit the Russian people, I think the U.S. winning against Russia is something that would benefit the confidence of the American people. So that's why I'm hawking for war here. I'm not hawking for war against some small country that's anti-democratic, because obviously, who cares? Okay, the people in that country care, obviously, but it's not one country's business to just mess around with other countries. And even if it were, what we see is that the U.S. is very inconsistent, because the U.S. supports Saudi Arabia, which is an very strong monarchy. So the U.S. obviously picks and chooses its allies, and democracy isn't the priority, nor do I think it should be, because we need to think about real problems and not idealistic differences when we pick our allies. And I think that that's a huge problem in politics, not just in the U.S., but worldwide. There's a huge trend towards idealism as opposed to realism, where when I read the Federalist Papers, I see what I would say is something that in many ways bore out of realism, in contrast to the anti-Federalists, who were very idealistic. Not to say that the Federalists are wholly realistic. I think that they're leaning more towards realism than idealism, but they're not ideologically committed to liberalism in the same way that the anti-Federalists were. But nowadays we're seeing liberalism, we're seeing socialism, we're seeing nationalism, all these, we're seeing populism, we're seeing all these idealistic ideologies, and what we need is realism. We need to understand that you mess around in Ukraine and you find out. And U.S. messed around, U.S. found out. Not saying Putin's right. I'm saying that this conflict has already started at least in 2013. And the U.S. and Russia have been involved since the beginning. So I'm not saying that either side is taking the moral high ground. I think both sides have no right to take the moral high ground. But at this point, it is the responsibility to finish the conflict and to win or to quit. And I think the U.S. should not be the quitter in this situation. Okay? But that's my opinion on here. I understand that a lot of things I said may be controversial, but you know what? Who cares? So anyway, tell me what you think. Do you agree? Do you disagree? Do you have another position? Do you think that actually Putin is entirely right, which I don't agree with? Or do you think that Biden is the best president ever? Do you think that the Obama foreign policy that led to a lot of these problems was correct? Tell me what you think in the comment section below. And I will be seeing you all next time on Wiltus Over and Out.